So basically the Royal Botanic Gardens in Cranbourne, we hail from Bunurong land out in the southeast of Melbourne. Just for a bit of context, for those who haven't visited us there, we have 370 hectares. About 20 hectares of that is botanic display gardens, and the other 340 hectares is remnant bushland in the area. Still fairly intact, we're really lucky, particularly because it is within the urban growth boundary. To give you a bit of an idea, this is what it once looked like. Obviously still post-European settlement because there's a lot of farmland around us. And over the last probably 10 to 20 years, this isn't even the most up-to-date photo of it. So that little parcel of agricultural land at the bottom there is, this little parcel of the agricultural land at the bottom there is now also being very rapidly developed. So most of that's already gone and looks very similar in the roofs and dense urban sprawl that you see in front of you. When you drive in through our beautiful site, you do wind about 1.8 kilometres through that bushland to begin with. And to give you an idea of what you might see as you drive in, you're a bit slow to get started. But these guys were essentially not just this species, but this is the type of thing that was the catalyst for our project. Ridiculously cute, I think is the way you would describe that. Unfortunately, sorry about this, was the least horrific photo that I could have put on to still get the point across. It is a 1.8 kilometre road that does go through natural bushland. We have, hundreds of thousands of visitors come to see the Botanic display gardens every year, and that does create a conflict and interface there between that bushland and the road that everyone's driving on. So when I first put this presentation together, apologies, it was a little while ago, we had nearly 700 fatal impacts recorded. That was just hand records over a few years. That is ridiculously underrepresented. That's just what was seen and what was written down. That doesn't account for animals that weren't killed outright and headed out into the bushland and died without being noticed, animals that were predated once they were killed on the road and that sort of thing. Of that, we had a huge amount of reptiles. I think the next image is broken. It is, so ignore the blank spot in the middle. Lots and lots of snakes, heaps of Jackie dragons, not just crossing the road. Those guys were just sitting on the road, trying to get a bit of sun and, don't move, unfortunately. And obviously as well, the southern brown bandicoot, who is a federally endangered species, and we're really blessed to have one of the last remaining hotspots in an urban area around Victoria, and we had over 100 bandicoots in our records of roadkill, and unfortunately some of them had pouch young, so we were losing 2 generations of an endangered species in the blink of an eye. So for my team who were looking at, we essentially had to go collect all these animals up off the road. We knew that we had to do something, we couldn't just stand by and watch. So looking at an aerial of our site, you can see the Botanic display where that red sand garden is and the surrounding car parks and things like that. Every single one of those dots was roadkill. Why we were seeing some hot spots? So in that line, you can obviously see the line follows the roadway into the gardens. What you can't see, because there's so many dots, they actually stack on top of each other. If you were to zoom in, those little spots where you can see the little waves on either side, they're hot spots. They're dots stacked right on top of each other, lots and lots of roadkill. And the reason we were finding those in those areas is because there are natural water bodies on either side of the road, so wetlands and things like that. So the visitors who were coming to see us, their point A to point B was the front gate to our car park so they could go visit the Botanic display, whereas the wildlife's point A to point B was crossing the road from one water resource to another. So they're mostly natural wetlands and things like that. That was what they were looking to move through between. So some of the things that we tried already, we have a very, very slow speed limit. It was 25 initially, but we did some traffic observations and we actually raised that to 30 because nowhere else in Victoria has a 5 kilometre incremental speed increase. So we moved that to 30. That didn't work. We also have slow down for animal signs, also didn't work. We were still getting lots of roadkill. Plenty of speed humps, still doesn't work. We know that if speed signs and things like that worked, the police would be out of a job, and they're not. So just you can have all the signs you want, and unfortunately, people will still be impatient and want to get from point A to point B. So we selected, knowing where the roadkill was happening, we selected a trial area on our site. I'll skip over that a little bit because since we did this, we've actually now done the full 1.8 kilometres of the road, not just the trial area. So the old infrastructure that used to go underneath that road was just drainage pipes. Our hydrology had changed, so there wasn't a lot of water flowing through those pipes anymore. But there was a lot of wildlife already using them. Quite small pipes, but lots of blue-tongue lizards and things like that would use them. The new infrastructure, we didn't remove any of the old drainage pipes because they were still serving a function. The new infrastructure were purpose-built wildlife underpasses. So the difference being they were a wider opening, specifically to meet the kind of animals that we were seeing mostly in our roadkill profiles. You'll notice in that image on the right that they've got some lighting along the top. Now, they're just ventilation slots in the top of the culvert pieces. They are installed at the road surface level, so it actually allows in natural light and natural airflow as well. This is a very sped up couple of days of the old pipes. So we already had proof of concept. We already knew animals were crossing the road using some kind of pipe. We also knew where roadkill was still happening, where there weren't pipes and where there were resources that drew them to those parts of the road. One of the interesting things you see in this video is there's a lot of rats crossing through under here. So they're swamp rats, they're one of our native rodents. They don't actually show up a lot in the roadkill profile. And it's an interesting observation because people often think that if something's been killed on the road, that's the animal that is impacted by roads, which is true, but there's also a lot of species that are impacted by roads that aren't being killed. So swamp rats simply won't cross the road. It's too exposed for too long. It's beyond their threshold of exposure. So the road itself actually ends up isolating their populations within the landscape. So even though they're absolutely in the area, not being shown in that roadkill profile doesn't mean that they're not being impacted. So we'll just go through all the cute videos rather than lots of writing and things like that. This is one of our guys who, did you hear that sound? So that was a vehicle going over the top of that culvert at exactly the time that this animal, who you'll all be able to recognise in a second, stepped out onto the road. So that would have been a deceased animal at that point. You can hear the sound, it was quite a dull sound, and you don't see a reaction in the animal that would suggest that that animal, is deterred by that noise. It's because the culvert pieces are made out of a polycrete substance, so they don't have any moving parts. They're a single mould. They don't rattle and things like that. It's just a dull thud as it goes over the top. Again, ridiculously cute. How can you not want to save these guys? And unfortunately, at this time of year, you probably, I hate to say it, have seen, these guys are on the move. It's breeding season, and I don't know how you hit an echidna on the road because it's not like they're darting out in front of you, but we see so many killed on the roads, and it's just heartbreaking. Here's another guy. And you see the car go over again in the shadow. So this is our flagship species. Most of what we do at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Cranbourne is around this guy, but they are just that flagship. They capture all the other species as well. So that was a southern brown bandicoot. Again, you see the car go over the top at the exact time that he jumps out on the road. So again, it would have been a deceased bandicoot. So a couple of the infrastructure things that make this project really effective. It's not just the underpasses. You can't just whack in underpasses and go, animals will use it. The question we always get is, how do they know? They don't know. We put it where we know animals typically cross, so that's the first barrier for us. But then we install fencing on either side in the areas. Now, if you've only got a habitat corridor crossing a road, it's a narrow strip, that's quite easy. You just fence either side and it captures 90% of the animals that are using that corridor and it funnels them towards the underpass. A few key things, it's dug into the ground to stop our friends the wombats who like to dig underneath everything, leaving breaches. You can see it's got a backwards facing top flap. That's to make it a bit of a one-way fence. So animals will come up from the bushland side. If they try and cross over that fence, they kind of hit that flap and it just pushes them back into the bushland area. And you can see our friend the echidna again trying there. We'll have a talk about that little perspex flap that he's near in one moment. This is just me being selfish and putting in some really cute photos to break up the day. Obviously, it's not just, terrestrial animals. They are the main ones that we're looking at with underpasses, but we absolutely get koalas, including joeys on their backs, still using these. So the early results were really, really positive. Again, these are a little bit from when we just did the first trial. We now have done the whole section. It did have some problems. So we were still seeing a few roadkills happening within our fenced area. And you can see there's a few spots. Now, in the very middle there, you can see a little cluster of spots and a few others. And what that main one was, bloody wombats. So we have to have fences. We've got maintenance tracks that come down to that road. So there are fences. Unfortunately, gates, you can't dig the fence into the ground if you need to be able to open the gate. Wombats insist on crossing there anyway. We're lucky, we're closed from 5 p.m. in the evening right around till 9 a.m. the next morning. So we don't tend to get wombats show up in our roadkill, but that didn't stop them from wrecking our project. And unfortunately, where they pushed through, they allowed other wildlife to get back through. And so we were seeing some roadkill. So we installed wombat gates. We basically said, well, if they're going to keep pushing through, let's let them cross the road because they're only crossing when there are no vehicles anyway. It is a road. It's open at both ends still. So you can never just fence it entirely and stop wildlife being able to get on the actual roadway. So we need to make sure that if animals do get on the road, that they can still safely exit. So we came up with these emergency one-way exits. So you'll notice our fencing is made out of a solid black plastic. That black plastic is a purpose in itself. So rather than it is a recycled product, which makes it good, the fact that animals can't see through it like they can with mesh means that they're not constantly trying to find a way through. If they can see bushland on the other side, they will move through and try to get to that. So we had the solid black plastic and then we put in the clear perspex flaps that only open towards the bushland. And what we know is that echidnas, certainly lots of wildlife are very quick to use them, but echidnas look like they've been going through these things their whole life. They walk along the solid black plastic on the side of the road, and the second they spot a bit of bushland through the perspex, they turn in and they walk through without any problems. A couple more videos, let's hope these work. This is a Bandicoot. There were problems with our early iterations of the emergency exit. So you can see what happened there. He tried to push through and there's a bit of a dip underneath, so our install wasn't great. So we knew that failed straight away. We saw these on our cameras. We have cameras on everything. And so we just filled in that gap. And this is them going through another one. And it was no problem at all. These guys weigh next to nothing, so they're quite happy using that really light perspex flap with no problems. This one, speaking of things that weigh next to nothing, a sugar glider, a Krebs glider. So for some reason they've misjudged their glide, they've landed on the road at night and they've still found those exits and managed to push their way out quite successfully. And I've cut my things down quite substantially here. So please, if you want any more information on the project, any of the specs on fencing and underpasses and that sort of thing, have a scan. It's got heaps more cute videos and that sort of thing and lots of explanations. Otherwise, reach out to me at the Gardens and I'm happy to share everything that we know.
Okay, we're going to do some questions with Tricia. Cam, do you have some more? Yeah.
Sorry, you mentioned it, but you didn't come back to it. On predators sitting at the entrances and exits waiting for prey to come.
Yeah. It's a great question and it comes up at every single presentation that I do. I think on one of the satire shows, they show foxes sitting at the entrance to these things and it's like a little Bandicoot sushi train and they just sit there and eat everything that comes through. So it's actually known as the prey trap hypothesis and there's been research done into it and there's actually no evidence that supports the idea that a predator will sit at the end. It sounds really logical, like you would assume that a fox will do that. We do have foxes on site at the Royal Botanic Gardens, despite predator-proof fences. We open to the public all day and foxes will happily walk in. We know that we see them every now and then. They pass our cameras that are on the underpasses. We've never seen any evidence that they sit there and wait for animals to come through. And this project's now been in place for a number of years, and that's never shown up. And there's been specific research into that in America that looked at a lot of their underpasses as well, and it's actually been shown that has no supporting evidence. So it does sound logical, and I think the more underpasses you put in, if you're still concerned, obviously means they can only watch so many, but we certainly haven't seen any evidence of that. Yeah, you make a number of good points there. Again, we're really lucky at the Royal Botanic Gardens. I've got my team on site 5 days a week. I'm also super blessed to have Dr. Terry Coates, who's our ecologist, who's been based 5 days a week at the Cranbourne site for 25 plus years. And so we do have long-term monitoring both prior to putting in something, so we knew how to tackle the problem because we had that data, and also moving forward. So Terry's in the process of writing up all of this, all of our findings, and that will be published. So keep your eye out, and if anyone wants to reach out, and we can send you copies of that once he's completed. We also see foxes on occasion go through, and these particular underpasses are only 500 millimetres wide by 300 tall, and foxes will still go through them. We worked with Cardinia Shire in a consultancy aspect, looking at some underpasses in the Kooirup region, which is another hotspot for southern brown bandicoots. We didn't have fencing on those ones just because we had more constraints around roadsides and things like that. But we did find from cameras on that we had cats going through those ones. I know everyone in the room loves cats here. Ironically, the cats weren't actually going in to kill the bandicoots. Cats are awful around bandicoots typically, but these cats would go in, we'd catch them on the camera going in the morning on a hot day, and they'd go to sleep in the middle of the underpass because those ones weren't quite like the ones that I showed here. They stayed damp and cool. It was on hot days. They'd go in, and then the next time our cameras were triggered was later on in the afternoon when they'd had their sleep and they were heading out. So even though they weren't caught on camera killing the bandicoots on that occasion, obviously a bandicoot's not going to use a culvert if there's a cat sitting in the middle of it. And again, another good reason why that monitoring's so important, because we can feed that back to Cardinia and they can look at their, cat regulations. It's meant to be cat curfew 24/7 there, but obviously they need a bit of work on that.
Yeah, has there been any work about the exits? Whether you put some vegetation on the exits, or is it really, you really need that sunlight to encourage moving through the tunnels?
I think when you're looking at roadsides, the amount of light that's hitting a roadside is already pretty good because of that clearance for the road itself. We find as far as entry and exits to the underpasses, obviously you do need a certain amount of vegetation. It all depends on the landscape around the underpasses. So for us, we're really well vegetated. This is through pretty dense sort of heathy woodland and damp heathy woodland and that sort of thing. So we've got plenty of vegetation in that aspect. Where we've done it, where we've advised on it in agricultural areas and in urban developing areas, we have suggested that they put some, powers and things like that, because we're talking specifically from a southern brown bandicoot perspective, but certainly something that allows them to get to entries and exits of culverts safely and encourages them to head in that direction. As far as the fencing and seeing the light through that, it is purely the difference between the opaque solid black plastic fence and then you can see anything, even through, sort of scratched up perspex, you can see something different. And it's quite incredible to watch wildlife walking along this fence and then turning in like they've been doing it their whole lives. It's super, super effective. But we didn't do any extra clearing other than we were working on the road shoulder to begin with.